Right, I presume that you can see the slides, yes? Okay, so this is a talk that's very much about a central policy for the workforce and for the economy in Singapore, and that today the content will cover those points that I just put up here in the first slide. Now, the first thing to do, I think I would like to, because the research interests of your center, is that I'd like to highlight the way the education, the role of education within the Singapore's economic strategy. That's a kind of context first. And next, then I will kind of fast forward that to the policy known as Skill Future, which was introduced in 2015, what that policy is about. And next, after that, is that I'll explain the ecosystem, because the ecosystem itself reflects the kind of ambition, the underlying thinking of Skill Future. So it's good to have a look at the overview of that ecosystem. So it's going beyond just the education sector. And of course, some of this may be implications about the role for higher education and maybe other segments within the education sector in the future to come. And next to that is that we will identify the roles of the implication basically for the different segments of the education and training sector. So it's going beyond the formal education sector. Lastly, I would draw some personal, I would add, conclusion from what I have seen over the years, and also now where I stand, looking at the continuing development. Nothing is kind of complete, mission complete kind of situation. It's still going on. I have to add, as a caution, that this is a very much a personal view, and also what I know of the kind of, for example, challenges that colleagues would face and so on, and also therefore for other people or parties to take note of. First of all, a little bit of a context thing, but I'm going to make use of an academic concept known as the developmental stage, a way to kind of set the scenes first, especially for those who are not familiar with the policy context or the political context, or even as well the economic context of Singapore. Although what I'm going to tell you was a very good framework for explaining the Singapore's case. I would imagine that some of the elements in there have changed a little, and also may have been diluted a little in more recent times. But nonetheless, in ballpark terms, that's a useful kind of a tool, a vehicle to explain Singapore's kind of policy orientation. So first of all, this is about, the basic concept initially introduced by Chalmers Johnson. And originally, the concept of the developmental state was something that to explain the rise of Japan in the 60s. But it turned out to be quite useful to explain a number of other countries that where the state policies taken, what is being used as the kind of driver or engines for growth. So here is that I emphasize the word, the word industrial policy is still a keystone in driving a lot of the systems within the country. So we say, what do you mean by that? So it could include transportation, housing, and very few people that even know, they may know that, oh yeah, Singapore looks like this garden city, fantastic. And one colleague mentioned that it's disgustingly clean. And in fact, it's partially industrial policy. And the government saw the needs that in the countries that were so hot, where, kind of, a lot of the natural elements could be a bit, tough, is that at least we can do something that is attractive, a safe city, for example, very low crime rates, almost none at all. And then on top of that is that the garden city concept is that it's attractive for people to say it's beautiful. So people don't realize that industrial policy is so encompassing. And in the case of Singapore, it is so. And secondly, the state established this elite-oriented bureaucracy, meaning that it's all very well for the political leaders to have a grand idea. You really have to have a structure, a vehicle, a machinery to deliver that. So that was, Johnson's early ideas observing the Japanese case was applicable in many of the developmental states countries to come. Yeah. And thirdly is that there is a very close link between that bureaucracy or the government machinery and the private sector. In the case of Singapore is that a lot of the policy ideas actually is needed, and it's turned out to be the case that the private sector support would be, it turned out to be very important as the key success factors, because you really need substance and you need some kind of initial energy to start off a lot of the key policies. Thirdly is that at the same time, now this is a kind of almost like an ironic kind of feature, at the same time, having made the link between the business sector, for example, the private sector as well as the government sector, is that the government also has to manage to not to be affected by the hindrance of special interest groups. So it can, like the classic example in the old days, I think it's less so. That's why I said that some element has become more diluted. Globalization is one of the key factors in this, is that both in terms of the Singapore, let's say Japanese governments, and the early days, 2-3 decades of Singapore, is that the state could resist a lot of specific demands from capital and labor. Lastly is that Johnson's idea is that people misunderstand the idea of a state-less system, thinking that the state would run everything. No, far from it. In fact, it's the market that has to function in order to create the surplus, the fat that linked to a point that Johnson missed out. So what was missing was added back onto the developmental state model by Robert Wade. Now, actually, I think this is one of the most important elements in the developmental state model, which is that when a country or state makes progress, no matter how small, that fat, that piece of fat, as it were, surplus, if you like, has to be put back into productive use that will enable the country, not so much about growing the cake, of course that would be the outcome, but to systematically move up the global value chain. You can see that, and again, when Singapore practiced this, it didn't have the competitors like China. It didn't have some other low-cost countries, so many like Vietnam and Cambodia and so on. So it worked really well. Of course, increasingly the challenge becomes tougher as you go along. So these are the defining features, and some of it's a bit weakened a little bit because of the global environment has changed. So this is very much reflected in a statement that made in the 70s, when Singapore was at the crossroads between moving from labor-intensive kind of industry that established in the early days and onto the next step. Here is that I think the important point to make is that Lee Kuan Yew, for our younger audience, probably they may not know him too well. is the founding father of Singapore, and who has a very, very unique and very powerful kind of leadership, quality that made Singapore and enabled Singapore to make the progress that it has done so. Now, in this speech here, he's deliberately, to make his point, deliberately to single out Hong Kong's comparison with Hong Kong at the time, which is slightly ahead in terms of industrialization. So he said that they deliberately sought more skill-intensive and less export-sensitive industry, like machine tools, electronic meters, miniature ball bearings. Ball bearings, interesting things. Very few people know that the industrial needs a lot of those things, and in low skill, mass production. Now, such industry need workers who are literate and skilled in working machines. We invested heavily in our young generation. We had a trained and educated workforce. That's at the beginning. Then, industry needing such a workforce came and set up operations in Singapore. And because they enjoy more sophisticated and automated machines, therefore they have higher wages. And the next thing he pointed out is that, so the old factories whose products had a high labor content, with examples there, they stopped expanding and began to move out. And the government actively encouraged this and the transfer of labor-intensive industries. So therefore, freeing up the resources and the energy towards the skills and the industries and the jobs of a high, of the higher value chains, right? So this is something that very explicitly done, and still the case today. So to sum up that context is that Goldennathan, who's retired now, is a historian in education, in the education system in Singapore. He concludes that in a short statement, that education kind of is subject to tight coupling of education and training system with state-determined economic policy. As simple as that, but against all the complexity that I just described. So fast forward, why I say fast forward? Because right from 1965, when the country became independent, there have been wave after waves of continuous kind of reforms in the workforce system. All of those stages had their own specific kind of emphasis on, like the earlier ones, on basic education. Just it's important to read, and so on, and then later on to kind of intermediate skills, etc., and diversification. So, but the latest one is one that quite unique. So because in the old systems, they had one defining feature, just training. More bums on seat would be good. Very simple criterion. More is better, just train. So it's a supply concept through and through. So, and even when I started in Singapore, 2001, still the main thrust of the skill system was supply driven. So perhaps we start with definition about the latest round, Skill Future. What is that about? The first point to make here is that unlike other systems in the past that Singapore has, this time we describe that as a national movement. Wow, what does that mean? Because it may go beyond just programs, funding issue, and we are talking about some kind of cultural issue, behavioral issue, all roll into one. Is a movement. So immediately we can see the scope of that may be quite big. So the training side is that, unlike in the past, is that the learning and training side is very much kind of front-loaded. But now well, like there's a lot of other countries, of course, not unique in Singapore. And then after that, it's employers' responsibility. And the state asks for kind of very little involvement, except probably in situations where there are a series of sector school council, they do something, right? Otherwise, employers' responsibility. So now the next emphasis would be that it's a movement by covering different stages of people's life. So this is a statement that also during the kind of announcement stage from the government that we see the kind of, so still, what does that mean, you ask? So whether you are students, a working adult, starting out in your career, or a professional in your mid-career, or experienced workers in your silver years, you can access a wealth of resources to help you attain skills mastery. Why do I just underline the last word? In fact, is that everybody just pay attention. The last word, skills mastery. So no longer coming for training and all that is a one-off, maybe front-loaded, and maybe occasional, maybe accidental. The ideal of skill future is skills mastery, which may not be done. I mean, some people mention about a more mechanistic way of describing skill mastery, or 100,000 hours. That's what you need, kind of thing. No, in Singapore, it's not quite like that, or skill future is not quite like that. I think we deliberately remove that mechanistic interpretation, but skill mastery. So, but then the other aspect to it, which is really trying to tackle the changing nature of education, the purpose of education, and the consequences of education, is that a skill future tries to steer or re-steer of learners and education institutions that look, paper chase was something that we did very well without saying that, but we did very well, very successfully. But this time around, the game is not about paper chase. So for skill mastery, maybe there is no qualification about it. Maybe there isn't a particular qualification about it. That doesn't mean you stop learning and deep skilled about your knowledge about that particular subject. So that's another very substantial change in the orientations of all the skill systems that Singapore had before. And the consequence of this is that it tries to move towards excellence through knowledge, application, and experience. Now, of course, these are the objectives or ideals, right? We'll talk about later on, how much these are challenges still. So that is the quote from the education minister at the time, Ong Ye Kang. And he was my boss, funny enough, when I started in Singapore in 2010. He was the boss of the Institute of Adult Learning. So he outlined three big ideas of skill future. Mastery, he said, meritocracy, and you. Now we'll come back to about you. I only underline you and not the others. I mentioned, of course, mastery, but meritocracy interpreted in Singapore is a little bit differently. In most countries, it means that it's kind of some criteria that through which your success recognized and be promoted and rewarded, etc. Generally has a more kind of egalitarian aspect to it, hopefully in today's interpretation. But in Singapore, it's been interpreted as more about equality, that everyone should have a chance to have a go, So it cannot guarantee your success, but have a go, and policies to enable you to have a go. Why I marked down you? Again, it's very different from the past. The past is that all the training things driven by economic utilities. So at one time I mentioned about early on, basic education, secondary education in the 70s, big movements that was pushed through the system. Many of the migrants that became Singapore citizens, by the way, a lot of the people in Singapore, their parents in particular, or parents' parents, that they came from China, India, Malaysia. They were migrant people. They were transient. Once they made a few bob, they would go home. But of course, in the case of Singapore, becoming a country in its own right, that's no longer the case. But all the training thing is all about gearing people up to support the economy. For the first time, it's just think about topics like mastery. It needs you to pick what you really want to do. So the policy challenge and the education provisions and training provisions have to go beyond the comfort zone that what was previously well-defined, been working on 20, 30 years, all the vocational training agendas and a formal education agenda, the kind of the menu, if you like, is been tested and tried, and they work, right? Now that's the new direction. What do individuals want? So that they can become a master of some insects or whatever, expert in something, and be innovative in that knowledge, application and knowledge, right? So in a nutshell, what's the difference? I think I'd like to put 2 or 3 comments here. At different levels of interpretation, you may have a different kind of a view about it. Maybe that at the policy level and the kind of simply is a skill, it's training a skill workforce, there isn't much change. The bulk of skill future actually moved from the old system, the provision, onto, and then of course the new challenges had to be bolted on top. But the bulk of it in 2015, 16 and 17, the core of the system was very much still the old system, but now being integrated into one platform called Skill Future and lifelong learning as the vehicle to deliver that skill future ideal. So also from policy terms, how we support the infrastructure and all that, actually a lot of the old infrastructures were there, or still kind of thing. So I think the difference is hard to find. I made a comment. But the last comment is that, but at a different level, if you talk about scope, approach, and structure later, because you have to bolt on extra elements, Skill Future has gone significantly beyond the previous education and training policy and provision. It is there that I can summarize in the little table that scope, approach, and structure. You see that before and after. So in terms of scope, before that, one thing that worked very well was a demarcation between the PET, the pre-employment training system, which is essentially the kind of, like, if you like, school, kindergarten, school, all the way to university, the pre-employment segment, PET, and the CET, the continuing education training segment, that's after the formal education sector. Most of the people will be 23, 24 years old and beyond. The segment that I mentioned in most countries, that was employers' responsibilities. But in Singapore, there's a specific segment, which is the one that I joined, by the way, the Workforce Development Agency, WDA, in 2010, at the back end of it. And that later on turned into, that WDA became Skill Future Singapore when the policy was introduced in 2015. So since 2015 is that the two sectors were put together, merged, so we say artificially in a way, because the inertia and the kind of very clear-cut work and objectives, KPIs, if you like, made a lot of progress, and it worked very well. But the boundaries after 2015 supposed to disappear. Now, the implication for it's important for the PET and CET sides. Previously, they didn't have to bother, they didn't have to worry about what went on in the other sector. They have their own, deliverables, as it were. But suddenly, you have to learn about what is going on in the other territory. So just for take example about schools and universities. So overall, the university in particular have a lot of kind of connections up to outside and so on. But now I am putting a question to you. I looked at your books, your students, 95% of them actually aged between 19 and 23. And I have got these, the silver, I just meant you looked at the list early on, the mid-career, the professional, the silver age groups. I can't see a single person in in the books and there. What are you going to do about it? Now, suddenly you realize the challenge is huge. So that's the difference for the scope and approach. Education excellence was previously, for example, what the PET side would focus on and did very well. Look at the PISA scores and all this, and just being good at the academic progress in that sense, an assessment. That was all you needed to know. And, therefore, of course, the system, in the education system, in other metrics also did very well, like quality of teachers, facilities in school, etc., etc. All those were done really well. But since 2015, many of these metrics, although retained, but not good, it's not good enough. So in a nutshell, that is more than just the statement I put there. Going beyond exam smart, excellence through knowledge, application, experiences could become, and some of these have become, the KPI of the education sector, the PET sector. So you have to demonstrate that, right? So it's tricky, right? And it's a challenge. It's not something that you've been doing for decades. So the next one is structure. Structure meaning that before the skill future is that the educational sector, the training industry, if you like, the labor market facilitation section, if you like, people that the policy people are looking at job search, job matching, skill mismatch, and things like that. And community development, like social coherence, is a big agenda. Inequality, not much, I think, in Singapore. I think by and large doing very well, especially since some of the additional elements since 2011, because it was spotted in 2011 that the lowest 10% of the income earners had not had any real increases in real wage for 10 years or 12 years. So a lot of extra things were put in, and actually that problems was kind of improved hugely, right? Now, having said that, is that they were previously, so the different segments pursue their own goals, doing well maybe. But then the new challenge, 2015, is that they have to work together to tackle new goals. One of them, of course, the lifelong learning situation, the continuing this learning, career development, and so on, and industry partnership. These are new things, and community partnerships, and so on. So especially today is that we have the so-called digital platforms that can integrate the effort, the work, the information, the communications very, very easily. Why can't we do that? What the question was. So we will have a go. So you can see that in that sense, something has changed. So my last slide, I think more or less about the skill future system. Here's to give you kind of an overview in here. By the way, the previous table and the comments I gave before, and this table is all mine. So don't take it as anything from the official source. It's the way that I absorb it, I understand it, or the way I think about it, the whole thing. So here, let me guide you through it, rather than all the individuals, are kind of little things here and there, too much for you to absorb. So I just put it simply. First, looking at skill future, there are 3 elements in here. Oh, and by the way, just let me retract a little. Skill policies in Singapore actually has 2 sides to the same coin. This is more or less still the supply element to it, but what is in the last 15 years or the emerging side of the same coin is the demands for skill side. In Singapore, there is another policy which is equally important, but more challenging to make progress even, is the industry transformation policy. Skill Future is a support behind that. So what is, and very quickly, because for today's focus, it's not on the industry transformation policy. So essentially, industry transformation policy is a kind of looking for, encouraging the exploration and adoption of new business models that have greater value add. So therefore the productivity impact, especially the new business models that can go overseas or global. So you scale them, it's no longer about Singapore, you scale it. So with that, it's more jobs and more high quality jobs. So that has its own structure. The industry transformation policy structure divided the industry segments into 6 clusters and 23 sub-sectors as such. And each one of those has a particular liaison side linked to Skill Future, informing Skill Future that from the economic perspective, and Skill Future is more than economic. Remember, I talked about the points there early on, that they have to take notice. So in that sense, is that Skill Future adding additional requirements to the supply side, to what was previously the model. So enough about the demand side, probably there's another topic another day. Let's focus on this map. Here, 3 elements. The first one is the PET sector, number 1, the top of the diagrams there. So I have missed out deliberately the conventional, the more traditional activities like research excellence. I can't say example there, but those activities about teaching and research, right? So I put the additional one in the box, the blue box next to it. That's, first of all, for example, I highlighted the industry engagement side. So you see there's the other element within it. So industry engagement side, in some cases that I think there's additional money actually given to the university to set up specific units that they provide a glue between the, let's say, departments in universities and industry or employers outside. So whether it is a technical subject that's sharing the lab, collaborative projects like it's been doing before, but to a particular level in terms of lifelong learning, what would that mean? Does that mean that it will spread knowledge to other segments in the economy, society? Now that would be, I think, something that Skill Future would be interested to know. The next one is one that I already mentioned. Would the institution itself, whether it's a polytechnic, not just university, or maybe even schools, that they want to think about new learners groups and so on. Schools little room to maneuver because already universal education is part of that. So community engagement, and which is one that I think the PET sector traditionally had little or less engagement with. So here, a classic example, especially at the higher level learning, is that to what extent, let's say, the institutes of higher learning in Singapore is called IHLs, covering beyond university, other institutions as well, that they could enhance the idea of social objective, social learning within communities. Obviously, a lot of these extra funding would be provided, by the way, and the bodies involved in there can't be asked to do all the extras without additional resources. Promoting lifelong learning, leading to skill mastery. Now, then in this case here, is that are we doing one-off engagements, or do we have the design thinking in the first place that when we present the learning opportunity for learners, is that at least in the mental map of these learners, that they can see that this is a series of things. It could be a series of things if you so wish to be engaged into. So it's kind of, again, changing the orientation of some of the things that IHLs may have been doing previously. Steering research towards areas of Skill Future policy of interest. So maybe in the past is that policy research that are often, of course, initiated by academics or indeed some other opportunities that came up. Sometimes research programs coming from the research councils and so on, they were driving. But now is that, look, SkillsFuture also got pot of money for research purposes, and these are the things that we want. Would you want to tap into it? We would like you to tap into it. And the last one is that for lifelong learning, is that some of the areas, I only name one here, by the way. Some of the others very hard to crack, which is a recognition of prior learning, because Institute of Higher Learning in Singapore is very rigidly, have been rather, less so maybe today, that's kind of, there's a pre-qualification that's required to do the next one and the next one. So experiences may count for less, and that kind of may not even recognize sometimes they enter into a course, etc. Learning. So here I only mentioned about micro-credentials and badges, but in fact, along the lifelong learning kind of discussion there, you have more items to go under that one. But that's just put in a nutshell to reflect to what I mentioned in the description of my talk today about the challenges to the education sector. But of course, when I talk about SkillsFuture, it goes beyond that. And therefore, I will go to the number 2 segment there, which was the segment that I was as a civil servant in, which was the CET sector. CET sector is basically, in the past, I'm put down the new challenge, new works there, but conventionally for a long time, it's been that Singapore has never had a kind of system or attitude or policy kind of focus that's such that it's employers' responsibility once you left. Maybe it is, but the government, so look, we can do more if we work together. I think that was the attitude, right? So conventionally is that they, for example, especially for vocational training, and of course in SkillsFuture, be more than vocational training. But WDA, Workforce Development Agency, when I joined, was that it covers the entire 80% of the jobs in Singapore already through the vocational training systems and the qualifications and so on, right? And a system of over 400 private sector providers. Some are very large, like constructions, retail, and so on, very large. Some are very small. Right? Now, that the system, the provision is very healthy, I suppose, because it's not just that there is a 95%, up to 95%, some slightly less, but still anything between 90 and 95% subsidies of the training costs coming from the government. And then on top of that, people who are absent from the job, the government would pay the absentee payroll at the entry rate to subsidize the employers. If you need some temporary workers to help out, that's the pot of money that you can use. So within WDA, the agencies, there is something that I've never seen in other equivalent workforce agencies in other parts of the world, is that it has, out of, for example, the 850 people, something like that, I think when I first joined WDA, a huge part of it, 200 plus, would be to do with the claiming system. The levies are coming in. The levy is small, actually. There are other funding systems. Maybe today I won't cover it. A very innovative of funding system in there. There's a levy as well. The claiming, the administration, the refund of the money and all that. It's a big job. So 200 odd people's in there. And then one section is missing in other system is the travel salesman, I call them. It's organized in this pocket that these people would go out every day and engage employers. The why it is in your interest and how can we help you to use training and skill development to support your business model, right? So in that sense, is that it's the system can't sit there and say, please come. It goes out there to find, engage the users, whether they're employers or individual learners. There's a component there for the unemployed, although unemployed, it's throughout the few decades that since independence, unemployment is always fluctuating between 3 or 2.5 to around 5%. In the financial crisis, it would be 5.6 or whatever percent, something like that. So the unemployment segment is small, although part of the system. So, but let's look at this box. So given that backdrop, I have put out additional items in there. And excuse me, I have to put the screen downwards so I can see my monitor. That, for example, here, the scope about skill future work is something new. So no longer we're training for the past or what ongoing, reproducing what's there. So future work there, there's a lot of elements I haven't shown here, which belongs to probably another part of, I think it's the third part of work, developing, let's say, a skills framework. Skill frameworks have career maps in it. Each job title can fit into one of these sector-based career maps. And as such is that there will be ideas about progressions. You can also see the elements, the proportional elements about digital skills involved in it. In that sense, is preparing the workforce for the future of work, i.e. digital skills ready, if you like. So the skill framework, I'll jump on now, was something that in production in 2015, it was prepared before that actually, before Skill Future was announced, but put into construction in 2005, 6, 7. By the time I think about beginning of 2019, it was more or less done. Is something that like this remnants of a very detailed SOC system and the ONES system in the US, as well as the very deep kind of content for career development within it. And as such, all the other, some other things that I think I haven't mentioned, but it's small thing. For example, all the PET sectors, they have to have career guidance, people trained to use elements of the skill framework. For example, assessment of the users, the occupational orientations, which is the Holland Code, for example, that with the jobs within the skill framework, a 1,000 odd job titles in it, the fit and the career prospects, these have to be explained in far more details in terms of also plus an assessment involved in it. So all these become the extra work of the skills agency. So we say now it's called Skill Future Singapore, which wasn't done before. Before 2015 was bums on seats, very much the case, right? So next is that I just mentioned career development via the skill perspective. Next is that we also have to steer, because always before 2015, these 400 plus private sector providers for people in work, we have to kind of steer them towards the new elements in skill future, in the skill future policy and provision. So I mentioned about credential, micro-credential, these other stuff, promoting lifelong learning as a concept and practice, and engaging new learners. Who are they? Just like the question that we asked of the PET sector. Adopting business models that will support the life cycle, deep skilling kind of approach. And next, of course, skill masteries. Now, in the past, remember, bums on seat was the skills agencies, targets, and KPI. And by the way, all civil servants would get, or every year they get different kinds of bonuses, and sometimes bonuses more than half the pay in the first place. This is a new agenda. And in the appraisal, these will come up. What they are doing in terms of changing the way that we operate, right? So these are new challenges as a result of Skill Future. So you see 1 and 2, and there's a 3. A 3 is very much the new products that I think I recall from 2013, before Skill Future came up, and I was involved in some discussion already, especially in terms of some of the specific elements in there. They wanted to measure skills, which really my portfolio within the skills agent, research on skill measurement, skill utilization, and skills linking to performance of individuals and organizations in particular. So here, the new elements in there is labor market facilitation. It's a simple and general phrase, but in it is that an IT platform, an IT-based platform, online platform, jobs bank has to be built. And it so has to work more than just a jobs portal that we encourage the exchange between employers and the kind of graduates coming along and existing workers to start making a portfolio in there for their own career development, right? You should always, not a bad thing, look to something that provide great opportunities for you to move on. And as such, you may require more learning. And within it, the Jobs Bank, I said, is not more than just a matching platform, but then linking to my Skill Future portal, which is for training, and my Career Future portal, which is for planning for career development within there. There are assessments, there are tools, and there are also documentary support that enable your case to be sold. So often the interesting part in the UK, I remember in my days, is that employers comes around to university before the graduates go out in the market. We do the milk rounds. There's no such thing in there. Employers who systematically trawl Jobs Bank to find the high flyers and get there quick online. Now you can see that a lot of interactions. These are news in there as such. And then of course, Skill Futures, they also provides a lot of the supports to the government, Skill Future portal, within the labor market facilitation. I only use one example here. There were different kind of source of funding and advice and various kind of facilities. So the Skill Future credit is an individual learning account that is top-upable over time, although timing is determined by the government when we look at the utilization rate of it. At the moment, there's no end date, but we kind of had a crossroads between having that end date or not having an end date. They have pros and cons. More about it in a minute. I will talk about the progress so far. Now, I hope, I'll stop here, that in a nutshell, this is like a kind of bird's eye view about Skill Future and the ecosystem, the elements in it, is beyond just either the PET or CET. Is actually a set of interacting elements. So progress so far, again, I emphasize, it's another reminder. This is a personal view here. And I'm not just probably talking about all well and good things. There will be things, look, there are things that have been difficult, and some of this may take time. It's probably a fair view. I'll go over the two, which are the two last slides I have. So first of all, I think looking as a whole is that previous system was very much the skills agencies work. So it was the WDA in particular, focusing mainly on training. And before that, it was Spring Singapore, which I was also, I think I was commissioned to do one piece of work to introduce the competence-based, the NVQ system, UK one, into Singapore as a pilot subject, which later turned into WSQ, which was a hybrid between the Australian system and the UK turned out to be. But then after 2 years, 3 years, it became its own because the localized element is so strong. But the first time, it's gone beyond that. Now it's a whole government effort in that sense, the governments that involved. So I mentioned about the demand side, for example, of the skill system. So in the past, the Ministry of Trade and Industry was seen as one that trade in external, and that we create jobs, we bring inward investment in. And of course, I used to also talk to the Ministry of Education about how many engineers we expect to have, that kind of thing. Not planning, but information exchange, shall we say. There is a committee for that. And now is that the demand side, the ministries, that the Ministry of MTI, as well as the other division within it, will work closely with the Skilled Future, the supply side of skills. And then within the supply side, the Ministry of Manpower, excuse the slightly old-fashioned label, but Manpower, and which looks after all the labor markets issues, regulations, and standards, as well as the labor market facilitation portal, the Jobs Bank too, and the other surrounding things. They all have to work together to form this so-called Skill Future content. So that is very new, and managed to do that, by the way. And it has delivered a relatively coherent career and labor market linked kind of TVET system. So TVET system, very much an educational kind of entity before, by and large, But now a lot of it now had to kind of make linkages to career development, deep skilling, and all that kind of things. And then labor market issues about mismatch of skills, maybe. I think in particular, the skills gaps is one that I think they pay more attention to. So that's another area that I do for Singapore, is in my skill and learning survey every 3 years, is that we measure in the business performance skills. So the one that I mentioned, SLS, is the measuring skills at the job levels, national sample, and then at a higher level, another survey of mine is business performance and skill surveys in measuring the skill concept at the workplace level. Is there that I have the skill shortage measurements, a whole range of things, obviously business models, technology adoption, etc., etc. But one of them is the skill gaps one. So the information that we can provide is so that the educational sector can have information to work on by sector, by job titles, and so on. These are, of course, now the links are there, that people are working with the links. Next is that I think, remember that the due are underlined, and skill future at the beginning, I remember that when the skill future credit was introduced, it's that this is about moving beyond the economic motive of training, beyond that. Of course, at the beginning, it's kind of 95% of the things in there is just the old system moving under one roof of skill future. Looks nice, right? And then the people say, look, with my skill future credit, individual learning, I'm interested, I want to be the yoga guru. Would you support that? Now, there were things like that. Look, the new economy may have a huge element, performing arts, dances, culture, maybe singing and music and so on. So are these no longer, were these not admissible? And then some others that slightly put a different way is that, well, I'm interested in learning new digital skills, and much of it provided online. I can just sign up to Coursera. Is that admissible? So in the early days, the policymakers were suddenly finding themselves, hang on, where do we go from here? They seem legitimate, but are we going to open up Pandora box and suddenly kind of, lose kind of a bit of a control, or maybe a bit of our original understanding of it? So funny enough, actually, the idea of due and all that deep skilling, mastery, and all these learning manuals, as it were, much wider, were supported. So I remember in a meeting of Skill Future Credit Progress, looking at it, and it was mentioned, to my surprise, if you count all the online one, big and small, 1 day credited, non-credited, 2 hours appreciation session, all that, there were over 20,000 items that are admissible from the master courses, first degree, or maybe in all of the provision in the PET sectors, a third sector organization, including unions and so on, what they provide for learning, they would be admissible. And there's a unit, and therefore, again, within the skill agency, SSG, Skill Future Singapore, have to sort of go through this the minute they put into submission and say, would you support this? So if you go into Coursera and so on, if the platform sends that it's from Singapore, the user will be alerted that this course that you're looking at is Skill Future credit friendly. You can actually go direct, we then fund it directly to the provider, etc. So it's very interesting that the non-utilitarian dimension has been opened up. It has increased awareness and the participation in lifelong learning among the citizens. That's yet another survey that I do yearly, focusing the skill and learning survey, the three yearly survey measures the more fundamental aspects, like the learning efficacy, the career efficacy. These elements don't change quite quickly. But the awareness, the activity aspect for lifelong learning, given the festival, the Lifelong Learning Festival, the Lifelong Learning Month for the policymakers and agencies and so on, is that there were lots that going on. So I have one survey that measured this to show that, and overall is that awareness from the very beginning is that, what is it? You know, the ordinary citizens, some are very old people, and say that, look, we don't really know what it means. What can I do with it? That kind of thing. So over time is that we measure this thing is that actually there have been increases now, and also coupled with utilization of the facility as well as the individual learning account. The PET sector has embraced looking at the activities and so on. We have lots of requests, the skills, the agency side and within industry, the Institute of Adult Learning. We have a lot of approaches from the higher education sector and so on, looking at, look, can we collaborate in some of these? Because the new learners could be the adult learner and so on, which is really the focus of the Institute for Adult Learning, where my post was based and so on. So there's a lot that going on that previously, before SkillFuture, I didn't see. And of course, the higher education sector wants to learn more and more about the job markets, the industry segments of what's going on in there. And next is that it has influenced the program design. I think much of it has been mentioned. I won't go into too much of that. And also lastly, to establish the link of supply between supply. So I missed that word, between the links from supply to demand. From the, whether the demand side come from the individual, like I mentioned earlier on, you, and the work side from employers and so on. So that very much strengthened. The last slide is about difficulties, or not something. I mean, just, you know, we notice some things are hard to move sometimes. Employer support has not kind of quite changed significantly. What does that mean? Is that I think yes. Employers understand SkillFuture and so on, because it's been promoted very wisely, regularly, continuously since 2017. Even people in overseas countries heard of it. You know, Singapore, of course they do. But in terms of the way that, do we see huge amount of employer-backed kind of training schemes or collaboration with? It's no more than probably previously, and it's kind of. It's not kind of one of those significant changes that you have seen. Next one is that individuals are still chasing paper qualification when it comes to learning. So I'll give you one example of that is that, oh, by the way, two examples. One is that within the formal sector, the PEC sector, is that a lot of these extra learning activities, most of them are still based on qualifications, etc. So because the learners want a piece of something, I don't know, it's psychological, it's probably from the labor market point of view, they want something like that. So they want a qualification. From the SkillFuture credit utilization point of view, I was surprised that, especially for the younger ones, under maybe 50s and so on, all the way down to the 20s, is that a lot of the money that they have in the individual and can spend on IT digital courses, and they all have kind of most of them qualification totally, because these courses are not kind of 2 hours, 3 hours away. It's kind of some duration. So there's no evidence really as such that, because it's a cultural thing, don't forget. And also there was a wider system. If employers, if even the government sectors, the agencies that within or ministry, they still use qualifications as a really important filtering lens, then you have to have it, right? So it's not, this movement itself, it's not just the supply side that you can make that kind of change. It needs a cultural change wider than that, and it may even take time. Maybe in 15 years from the onset of the policy. By the way, policymakers in Singapore still see that in the next 10 years to come, SkillFuture will be the main platform to go after the first now 6.5 years now. So that is something that remains to be open. Evidence for skill mastery is unknown. Now, within my one of my surveys, the skill and learning surveys, that we also designed a set of instruments to measure skill masteries, essentially along a kind of taxonomy that based on learning for general purposes and learning for deep understanding of that. But we only introduced that in the last round of SLS, which in 2017 on national sample. So one measure. But in the 2021 one, we just finished the pilot fieldwork. We don't know, we don't have a second measure there to look at some of these, right? We only have therefore cross-section measurements in 2017. But for the same job title, for the same individuals, because we are panels of the different sweeps, panel of the respondents are the previous respondents. So we have a longitudinal panel in every sweep, which come from previous sweeps. Attritions are there, no longer national representative, but within there, we have a same units being measured over time. So that's still, it's too early to make that judgment about skill mastery. It's not yet clear that, again, behavioral change is the result of skill future policy. Behavioral change, you probably recall that the Kirkpatrick level 3 maybe, is that within there, there's implicit understanding that learning means a transformation of knowledge, skills, or behavior, in this case, behavior. We really don't know yet. Again, maybe I have to again look into some specific tool to measure that one and have to introduce it quick. Seamless information in practice is rather difficult. You looked at the diagram I show you, just showed you. But in practice, though, I still think that improvement has been done. But if you look at people that work in school, I mean, it's a big ask. It probably will never be even totally possible about the world of work being an operational kind of importing drivers in the way that the school lessons to be run or additional extracurricular that has to be considered. Some can be done. I mean, it's 21st century skills. I think it's may inroad in some of that in there. But the seamless integration, because of when PT and CET, the distinction was removed officially, not in practice, officially, is that they want this kind of lifelong learning seamlessly moving across, and providers having this overall view is the ideal, but seamlessness is something that very hard to create. So therefore, you still have a bulk of people in each segment. Their expertise is what they do within the segment, right? So we have to balance it between realities and the vision that where it is. Adoption of skill framework by employers is still relatively low. Some adopt it. Now, the skill frameworks is a whole range of purposes. It is a very I think is an interesting tool from the academic point of view. But one of the things that the government wants out of a skill future is that HR people, recruitment work, promotion, and also the idea that there is a policy called progressive wage policy, which is currently being promoted by the government in terms of public contract bids in the two sectors. The government contracts are very big. Cleaning, all the government properties, cleaning contracts. So when skills are up in the job, wages, so in fact, the bidder have to put two envelopes in. One envelope is the design of the provision, and the progressive wage model has to be built into it. Now, the second envelope is the pay. Second envelope, not pay, the costing of it. Second envelope is not open until the first one is open and selected. So within there, is that governments would like the idea that more skill and more pay. That's the basic thing. So far, go to the second industry segment is the security sector. A lot of government properties, schools, libraries, swimming pools, public, all these have guards, security guards. And we have the same practice there, progressive wage and so on, and this is very useful. But we would like the other segments to do the same thing, and going beyond that HR practices, appraisal, therefore promotion, wages, and so on, all the other things or benefits have to sort of go with and encourage people to build skills. So that itself is slow in coming. I mean, the big employers, some employers, and some work very closely with government. And the developmental stage model, there's a link between state and employers. So we always have the quick to adopt employers, the same entities that will come along and they do that. But then progressively it's hard, not just with SkillFuture, but with other things as well. Utilization of SkillFuture credits, I wouldn't say low, I have to change it, by the way. I say I need to, don't put this online or to change it. It's kind of relatively slow incoming in a sense. So what you measure is that you have a lot of partial utilization. So out of the a few hundred, 500 Singapore dollars, about 400 US dollars in there, and they can top up with other facilities that they have in the other, because Singaporeans have different sources within their portal that they can see, they can fund this. Now, and sometimes employers would also co-fund some of this. So within there, you see a lot of sort of partial use, but not the whole sum being used. So that is one of the reasons why the government is kind of not in a good position to say, do we do a top up this financial year? So put another $500 in every account. Would it then store that money when the individual learning account, it has no dead end to it? So it continue, allows people to say, you don't want to rush it. Now, but if you put a dead end to it, when it was mooted at one stage, I remember some people quickly reacted to it. Then I heard of, and I did some qualitative interviews on top of the kind of numbers, is that some people said that, no, when I panicked that if the money would be withdrawn and so on, I did a quick binge buying online. What does that mean? And what he said was this: when I logged into my Coursera account, is that the Coursera AI or the machine learning part knows that I've been on it, I've been searching different things, and then suddenly it offers me, if I buy 5 courses, it'd be so much cheaper, a hell of a lot cheaper. So I bought 5 and trying to use up the account, right? Bought 5, and I ended up buying 10. I never had time to use them, he said to me. And then they got 6 months to go. So in the end, some may be wasted. You then created kind of spurious behavior. If you put a deadline to it, if you don't put a deadline to it, top up becomes an issue. You can't have huge amount of government funds stored up in preparation for this. You can't do it. So these are the practical issues about individual learning account, how it's to be administered, even if you create a culture of learning. Jobs Bank participants, both entities in terms of the employers and the individuals, I think I meant, and in terms of occupation, in terms of sectors, kind of the participations in it is uneven. So it has not become a very general tool yet. I think it hopefully can be, but over the years, because Jobs Bank was put up in operation very quickly when SkillFuture was introduced, because that was prepared from 2013, not 15. So quickly, I think about 2016 is already kind of up and running very well in that sense, and then started to build linkages with the course providers, with the assessment tool, with the career guidance advice, and with the individual kind of their facilities in terms of their funding sources, their assessment of their own skill profile, and so on, and aspiration, and the other one is the RISE code and so on that they built into it. It's uneven also in other sense. IT folks, professional people tend to go and use it, same as the companies to use it. But for others, for retail maybe, for food manufacturing maybe, now that's one of the big sectors in Singapore, and precision engineering maybe, except the engineers, and the others may not go into it. So it's still uneven. We would like it to be more general, is the word, rather than used by particular segments of the society. Next is that it's not entirely clear how SkillFuture works with the younger generation. Now, this is my own personal pitch. I've not heard it being formally discussed in any form official meeting, and that the latest generation is that you may heard of the people, they may be quite happy to work with, and they can engage in the gigs economies, and they like the new forms of employment rather than building a career. And also, what does career means in a more digitally prevalent kind of work conditions or environments or years to come? So I don't know how well that will work, because it's so a lot of deep concepts built into skill future. It needs time, it needs continuous engagement, it needs discipline, as it were, to some extent, to take advantage of what skill future can offer, or should be what it's about. While funding is generous, policymakers may therefore start asking the return to investment, right? So it's long term. Meanwhile, I don't think that question being asked at all, and probably in Singapore is not asked. But the this time around, the funding is much bigger, and then the variety of funding we have is that I think it is a general request in a lot of things in governments that I was involved in, that to look at the impact for a start, and often kind of in relation to funding, right? Not because funding is an issue per se. So we can't answer those questions yet so far, because it's a long-term thing, as I mentioned, all those things. I think that's it. I think as my, let me still get to the last page first. Hang on.
Prof Sung, I
stop here now, and that's it.
I think we don't have very much time left, and I think there's a lot of people who've got questions.
Okay, please open the floor. Yeah, please remind me and stop me.
There's already some in the chat, and we've only got about 10 minutes remaining. You've clearly got so much to say and so much information to share. So that was a real marathon presentation. Thank you very much. The one, I don't know if you want me to read out the questions from the chat, or if you want to just...
I think you should exercise your chair's prerogative to pick the one that you think I should answer.
I mean, I guess maybe we could start with just questioning. I mean, you know, the policy aspirations in Singapore were very similar to the policy aspirations elsewhere in the world. And many countries have tried to use the NVQ model, the Australian model and the British model, usually with almost no success at all. I know you have mentioned the things that haven't yet worked or that are not yet measured in Singapore. So there's some questions about, the one question says, is all of this based on an assumption that the economy keeps on growing? And is the real difference an economic one and not one of the skill system? I did pick up some differences in the way the skill system works while you were talking. Clearly funding is used differently to how it is used in other contexts. There's a question about accreditation of private providers. Are they permitted? Does the funding also flow to private provision of TVET? I think that you kind of answered that already. There's questions about, you know, is there enough space to accommodate all the graduates of the system? And then there's also questions about how do you measure this notion of mastery? How is it actually measured? And I think you did raise some issues about that right at the end. So we've just got there's two questions about this ideas of qualifications, employers looking for pieces of paper. The one question says, is this not still rational behavior on the part of individuals who are protecting, you know, their own job prospects and social mobility by making sure that they have qualifications? So a range of different kind of issues relating to the many very interesting parts of this system that you have shared with us today. I think we won't be able to take all of them. There was one on lifelong learning. And I just think it's fascinating that, you know, all of these things that you've spoken about are the policy goals and the policy aspirations in most countries, and most countries just are nowhere close to achieving any of them. So what makes the difference, and to what extent is there a difference?
Yeah, okay. I think you have to remind me to some of the other questions, but the first one I think you mentioned here, that skill future and what it tries to do depends on the economy continue to grow. I think the very first one. And therefore, I think the question was also linked to the funding issue. So therefore, then it will suddenly kind of go pear-shaped or whatever and not funded or being changed again. One of the reasons for Singapore's confidence in, I think in, this is again my personal view, but I put forward some such substance to it, that it can make such a long-term kind of policy and continues to build, has been building on it year after year, is that generally the workforce development or training funding is a bit different from elsewhere. It has different sources. Obviously, it has got a very large pool of the skill development fund, which is a levy, a small levy that only levies on low skill work, which really is a carrot and stick. If you want to get that carrot levy back, you have to do upskilling training and so on. But a lot of these people continue the business model, so and therefore claiming, they don't claim, they just back to the cost of running. Okay, usual problem with levies. So with a lot of money to fund training activity, plus the normal budget, which, okay, Singapore has been doing very well all this year in, year out, to the extent that it enabled a third source that I have never heard of from any other countries, called the Lifelong Learning Endowment Fund. What it is, if you think of that as when Singapore government year in, year out makes surpluses, it puts billions into the Lifelong Learning Endowment Fund, which works like the Norway oil fund, North Sea oil fund. It's a sovereign fund. So you put in there year after, when you have more spare money, you put in there. Therefore, the earnings from that to fund all the training, learning is not subject to the fluctuation of the government budget. It's big. So I never heard of any other countries done that. That is the way, because in Britain here, is that if there's a part-time, the first thing to cut is training. In fact, we don't even have the skill commission. We don't even have all the, because that's it, you know. Everything that the workforce elements, training side, push back the Ministry of Education, which looks after schools, you know. And it's that kind of the two extremes, as it were. One, thinking about how you defend that situation when there are fluctuations of budgets. Of course, in the good years, as it is, the question said, the city benefit, good years, of course, you have surpluses, right? And in Singapore, the principal budgeting is surpluses. And what it means is that, and every year, again, the citizen looked at, just like ours, now we have a big increase in national insurance. Everybody's kind of, oh, how about? In Singapore, people sit in front of the telly and look at the budget and say, where are the goodies for me? And it's forthcoming. So it's like Christmas. It's not like other countries. Budget day is a bad day, sad day for everybody, right? Who's going to get hit? Smokers or drivers? No, and that kind of, or drinkers. And so it's different. It's so different. So in that sense, so I think I answered that about funding or into about whether it's subject to economic conditions. I think that the upshot of that, I would suggest that if colleagues interested in this area should really examine this area, is that what is the scope of thinking of funding, and how is structured in relation to that, about the state of the economy? What makes the TVET system or the general workforce development system sustainable irrespectively? So the narrative in Singapore, the one last comment on this, is that in fact, bad times, if there are bad times, it's the times to train, so that you rebound quicker, so that you don't have to actually lose these people. And it's kind of, because the cost of retraining is huge, you might as well kind of mitigate that through our normal system anyway, which is already there, which is not subject to the fluctuation of the budget. Okay, so I think that's the end of my answer to that. What would be the second question? But
There were questions on mastery. How is mastery measured? There were questions on qualifications. Why, and you know, some colleagues were speculating on why individuals still chase so-called paper qualifications.
Okay. One is that mastery is, the government never defined it. It's interesting. I mean, when into the designing stage of the first round, 2017, say we must, there's 2 years after the policy introduced, it's still the early days of the policy, slowly taking being taken notice of amongst the citizens. So it's really that we had to sort of come up with some ideas rather. So, but we use clues from some of these announcements. So I showed you about the Minister of Education, that what he meant by it, about the one of it is the pursuit of personal interest aspect, and the next one is that repeated effort leading to the idea of knowledge and application and so on. So, and then another one is that you learn it for is a building block to following a learning rather than a one-off. And then another one is a paper chase issue. Is that it ought not to be a defining feature. You want to have a qualification to find a next job and things like. So it is those that we want to filter out the motivation for learning, because another section of the survey, by the way, is a range of learning activities in the last 12 months up to the survey, which, by the way, covers both formal, non-formal, and at the time we only had the two, but this round, 2021, we have, I think, the first ever. I have never seen any other colleagues or competitors introducing an informal learning instrument. So, which is the things that happen by accidents, happen by daily course of your life, that things that makes you think, makes you engage in another level, kind of say, do I find out something? Does it affect my behavior in some way? I'll actually do something differently next time. So there's a transformation of things going in the head, that through the informal incident and accidents or whatever, you know, the daily events is the word. So we introduce that as well into it. So there's a lot of, therefore, the behavioral side about learning and the purposes of learning, and then the nature of that learning that we're trying to filter out, and according also to the government's kind of the way that they construct skill future policy, as well as those, I call it kind of clues that they provided so far. So that's the way we do the skill mastery kind of index, the measurement. And why do paper chase? It's very much a cultural thing, plus meritocracy was introduced early on. Now, the Singapore government, or indeed the society as a whole, could be criticized as credential oriented, or then you put especially entry into governments, that there is a rigid system about not only that you have certain qualification, but which university you come from. Now that list, we call it the entity, the public civil service utility entity list is never published. No one knows that. But apparently, these things created a so-called, their version of meritocracy system is that papers or qualifications important. On top of it, the bulk of the cultures, which is Chinese and Indian, Tamils, so traditionally, they value qualification highly. So it's very hard to tear them away. To kind of, look at all these gurus in the Silicon Valley. Most of them drop out, and that doesn't matter. You've got good ideas, just pursue those ideas. So that doesn't kind of it's not having much currency still culturally and in practice term amongst the citizen at large. And that's not just my personal interpretation of it, that probably still be a time to come. The paper chase element, valuing, put a lot of value to the qualifications. It's not entirely, of course, a bad thing, right? So you're throwing to those kind of a dilemma, right? So yeah, what's the next question again?
I think we may have run out of time. I think we're starting to lose people because we were scheduled to finish at 5:30. There is a question about, is the CET only applicable to training related to the labor market, or can people pursue training in other areas of interest outside the workplace? There's a question about executive functioning, emotional intelligence, human skills. How do they feature in skills future framework? But I do think that maybe we need to wrap up. Maybe you could give very quick answers to those, because I think that quite a lot of people do need to leave at this point.
Okay, the quick one. What's the first one again? Sorry, I was trying to look at the question myself.
The first one was the CET.
Yeah.
Is it applicable to only training directly related to the labor market, or can people pursue training in other areas of interest that aren't in the workplace?
Yeah, the formal CET system would be by and large work-related, I think. And it is often, therefore, I suppose, one of the major platforms for the job-related one would be online, kind of different. You have more varieties because the providers can be outside Singapore. Coursera is a classic example, right? So there are other courses that therefore, I remember about cooking was one of the classic ones, that one of the job-related ones, very popular with the older age groups and so on. So that happens too. So that I hope I answered the question. Yes, mostly CET sector then is mostly job-related still. Yeah. Yeah. Next, any others? So if not, I wonder if I can copy. I find the question interesting in here, even if I can't answer them. Is that can I save the question as it were? Hang on. I presume again the.
So there was a question, Johnny, related to emotional intelligence and how issues around things like emotional intelligence are dealt with within the framework. If you want to take that quick.
Emotional intelligence, how it doesn't really. In part, by the way, the skill framework as one component within the whole skill future thing is that when we defined the skill framework in terms of functions, roles, and tasks within each job title, I think incidentally, it might have touched on if the delivery of that role, not specific task, maybe task as well, between those two, rather than function, between those two, then emotional labor is important. For example, as part of the communication skills, the higher level of it, because there are different levels as well, or different job titles within there. So it may come into it, but whether it's in a formalized form, in an academic kind of language, that I am not too sure, because there are thousands and thousands of those descriptors within there. I'm not gone through them one by one, as it were, although I know how the system works. So I say there's a partial answer to your query in a way.
Thanks, Johnny. Thank you. And see, there's a note from Heidi, who's from the Qualifications Authority in South Africa as well. Thank you, thanking you for a really excellent presentation. There have been some really positive comments, and even our WhatsApps have been going mad. So Johnny, thank you again from all of us at Real for your time, for sharing your many, many years of expertise that you brought into how things are working in Singapore. It's really been very interesting. I can see people leaving their email addresses as well for you. But we hope that
yeah, they can come to me. I invite them. Some of them gone. I invite them if they want to discuss and talk about various things that I become across. By all means, just email me. Yeah, please.
Yeah, yes. No, as long as we've every time we've ever trouble Johnny around anything. He's always been very willing to participate and
No, it's nothing better
to
to talk
help.
to people that share the same thing.
Yeah,
No.
absolutely.
Yes.
But Johnny, from all of us
Yeah,
at Real, thank you so much. And just colleagues, just to reiterate that the recorded seminar will be on the YouTube link, and we will be mailing, once the recorded seminar is loaded, we will mail that link to everybody.
Okay,
And you will all have a copy of it, and we will ask Johnny to share his slides as well with colleagues. But Johnny, from all of us, thank you so much. Colleagues, all of you online, thank you so much. We appreciate your participation. The next seminar is on the 29th of September, and it's Professor Susan Riley from Scopy at Oxford, who I'm sure Johnny works with a lot in the UK as well. I see he's a visiting fellow there as well. So hopefully you'll be joining us for Susan's seminar on the 29th of September. Keep well, colleagues. Bye, Johnny. Keep well.
Okay, stay in touch. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes,
Yeah.
oh, definitely. We'll
Thank
definitely
you, Professor Sung. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Prisha. Bye, Steph.